All right, so it's 7 o'clock. We'll get started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here for tonight's museum talk and sort of the first one of the fall-winter session. My name is Holly Benison, and I'm the programs coordinator at the Osgoode Township Museum. And joining me tonight is our volunteer Aiden, who will be moderating the chat for us for the Q&A period. So the Osgoode Township Museum acknowledges that our museum, located in Vernon, Ontario, just south of Ottawa, is on the traditional unceded ancestral land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Algonquin and Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of this territory along the Ottawa, Rideau, and Castor rivers and have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to be gathering here today to share stories as generations before us also have. So if you've never been to the museum before, the Osgoode Township Museum tells the story of Ottawa's agricultural and rural heritage in the former Osgoode Township, and we're open all year round, and we're very excited to kind of start moving into the fall-winter programming. And we have a very busy fall at the museum. So this weekend on October 18th, as of this evening, we only have one spot available for our broom making workshop, which will be hosted by Rachel Martin of Sweeping Willows. October 25th is our first time doing a trunk or treat, which is hosted by Ward 20's new counselor, Isabel Skalski. So we're very excited to be participating in that. And November 1st, we'll see our return of our second annual Pumpkin Smash. It was a lot of fun last year, so you won't want to miss it if you don't know what to do with your extra Halloween jack-o'-lanterns. And if you are a big fan of the Museum Talk series, or if you're, just joining in because you're a big fan of knitting, and if you have knitting to work on tonight, you're more than welcome to do so. Our next Museum Talk will be on November 13th, and that will be about Canadian artillery training sites during the First World War. And then kind of wrapping up the November um, sessions of programming, we will also have our last tea of the season, which is all themed around Victorian mourning. So we'll be showing off some artifacts from the collection. It'll definitely be a bit spooky, a bit macabre, but if you're interested in learning sort of the ins and outs of what made this period so fascinating, and you don't mind getting into the Gothic a little bit, then you'll probably enjoy this event. So as we get into the presentation, like I mentioned before, one of our volunteers will be moderating the chat. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, type them in the chat, and then those will be relayed to me during the Q&A after the presentation. So I'll introduce myself a little bit more. If you've been to our Museum Talk series before, you'll recognize me that I'm typically the moderator, but tonight I'm introducing myself and also doing the speaking. I mentioned my name is Holly. I'm the programs coordinator at the Osgoode Township Museum, but in addition to that, I've been working in the museum field since about 2017, and my research interests include living history, performance, culinary history, and textile history, with a specific focus on knitting. My talk tonight will kind of be bridging my personal and ongoing research interests in Canadian textile history with the unique collection that we have at the museum. So as I'll get into further detail, our inventory of the collection reveals that knitting-related artifacts total about 2% of the collection, which kind of shows an important and often underlooked area in museum research in general. So I will now pass the mic to myself to talk a little bit more about this subject. So, a knitted history of Osgoode Township is sort of a in-depth focus of the knitted objects, photographs depicting knitwear, and technology related to knitting that we have at the collection. So museum research is one of those sort of more behind the scenes activities that happens at museums of all sizes, and finding opportunities to develop programming to share that research is what I'm personally very passionate about. So this research was kind of done in tandem with finding ways to share what was done, but also for internal purposes as well. So to prepare for this presentation, our collections assistant over the summer pulled out all of the related objects and archival materials connected to knitting. And this inventory is highly valuable for a couple of reasons. To understand the breadth of our knitting materials, to create a permanent inventory list for future researchers, and to examine related artifacts together to gain a better understanding of the role of knitting in sort of this rural community. So in placing these artifacts in conversation with one another, we reinforce how highly valued knitting was historically, and how these objects blend spatial thinking, textile design, chemistry, rural and urban economic activities, self-fashioning, and personal expression, all factors which would have shaped the experience of knitters in the former township and beyond. So far at the museum, we've hosted three knitting-related programs. In October and November 2024, we did our own spin on the emotional support chicken pattern, which, if you're unaware, is the chicken that you see on screen. Very viral knitting pattern that is still very popular. So it was a casual knit-along session, and it was prefaced with a short presentation on the history of poultry raising in the former township. We highlighted a number of artifacts and archival references to help tell this story. And we had a hard time choosing which of the 56 egg cups in the collection we wanted to show off, and ended up settling for about three that we showed in the sort of online portion of the knit along, but we also did an in-person one at a knitting store in downtown Ottawa. So this was a great way to attract new audiences to the museum and also include some very unexpected learning, which was a great success. More recently, in April 2025, we hosted a grade 10 class for a World War I themed field trip, and the students rotated between three interactive stations with activities and lessons drawn directly from the Elmo Sully letter collection, who was a local boy who enlisted and fought in the First World War around the age of 18. He makes short references in some of the earlier letters that many of his friends were in the hospital with trench foot. So I use this as an entry point to discuss knitted comfort campaigns and the importance of dry socks, which I'll get into the research a little bit later in the presentation. But it was a great way to explain to the students the gravity that sock knitting had at the time. And then, of course, in June, we also hosted our first ever Knit in Public Day. We did a version of this presentation and put some of the artifacts on display for the day, as all of our knitting artifacts, except for the spinning wheel and shearers, are in storage. So this was a great opportunity for us and for our visiting knitters to kind of have this history put into local context. All right, so for the first time period, I thought the best way to organize this talk was to take you through a chronology of the township's history through knitting. For these early years, it's a bit difficult to be specific as we don't have many artifacts from this time. However, secondary research can give us an idea of what trends may have guided Osgoode's early knitters. So the Knitting Teacher's Assistant, which was a book, is kind of recognized as the first knitting manual, originally published in 1817 with additions up to the 1880s. Sock knitting has been a popular and very important industry and domestic skill for hundreds of years. And if the first settlers to the township knew how to knit, they would have favored a simple and repeatable sock pattern. The days of physical work ruined socks, as well as most of the year being cold maintained a constant need for warm things. And if you didn't knit, it was very common to pay another knitter for garments. Then, kind of moving forward in time a little bit, 1838, we see the publication of the Workwoman's Guide, which certainly would have been known to Canadian knitters. Both the Sock Knitting Manual and the Workwoman's Guide were originally published in England. The book comprises of 12 chapters covering topics and instruction in basic needlework tips, clothing for babies, children, men, and women, house linen, upholstery, covers and cases, household recipes, knitting, and straw plaiting. And then later on, in sort of the more Canadian sphere of book publication, we see authors Susanna Moodie and Catherine Partrail make reference to knitting in their books on life in the Canadian backwoods. These references give us a closer look at perspectives on knitting and aspects of the culture as they were in Ontario in the 1830s and 1850s. So Trail gives readers some general advice in her 1854 book, The Female Emigrant's Guide. She claims that, quote, "There is no country where there is so much knitting work done as in Canada. For when the household of a settler is supplied with socks, stockings, mitts, and gauntlets, the surplus yarn meets with ready sale at the stores when manufactured into socks, etc." Knitting was promoted as a necessary household skill and as a way to make an extra income for the family. And many aspects of women's labor at this time could also be sort of that extra source of income, including offering laundry services, butter making, and selling preserves. Knitting was another such economic activity. Having a reputation for being a good spinner and knitter was a desirable quality among single women, as usefulness, cleverness, and industry were prized in this country. Also, another direct quote from Trail. She also observed certain trends, what the knitting culture was like in Ontario at the time. And while traveling, she would frequently notice, quote, "hanks of yarn of different colors hanging on the garden or orchard fence to dry. There were all manner of colors, green, blue, purple, red, and white." It was also a common sight for young ladies to take their knitting bag out with them and carry it to the house of a friend when they go out. It is certainly a very sociable employment. And common patterns included socks, stockings, gauntlets, mitts, and children's socks, Striped mitts, flowered, spotted, and plain, ribbed and unribbed. Cradle quilts, large coverlets for beds of colored yarn, curtains, tidies for sofas, and toilet covers. So lots of variety there. In Moody and Trail's other novels, knitting is often listed beside other essential skills necessary for survival, which include sugar boiling, candle and soap making, baking huge loaves, manufacturing leavening, salting meat and fish, knitting stockings and mittens and comforters, spinning yarn on the big wheel, and dyeing the yarn when spun to have manufactured into cloth and colored flannels to clothe her husband and children, for there are no tailors or mantua makers in the bush. We also get what I consider a absolutely wild story in Roughing It in the Bush about Moody and a child being swindled out of $1 for a pair of socks, and then also possibly cursed. So I'll read this to you now so you can kind of see these books are being published. Women who are immigrating to Canada are likely reading these, so this might be the impression they're getting about life in the backwoods. So Susanna Moody writes, "The boy was without socks, and I sent him to old Mrs. H. to inquire of her what she would charge for knitting him 2 pairs of socks. The reply was $1. This was agreed to, and dear enough they were, but the weather was very cold, and the lad was barefooted, and there was no other alternative than either to accept the offer or for him to go without. In a few days Monaghan brought them home, but I found upon inspecting them that they were old socks, new-footed. This was rather too glaring a cheat, and I sent the lad back with them, and told him to inform Mrs. H. that he had agreed to give the price for new socks, he expected them to be new altogether. The avaricious old woman did not deny that fact, but she fell to cursing and swearing in an awful manner, and wished so much evil to the lad that with the superstitious fear so common of this country, he left under the impression that she was gifted the evil eye and was an old witch. He never went out of the yard with the wagon and horses, but she rushed to the door and cursed him for being a bare-heeled Irish blackguard, and wished that he might overturn the wagon, kill the horses, and break his own worthless neck." So there you have it, a glimpse of knitting in the backwoods. So in terms of what we have at the museum, we don't have many artifacts that come from this period either, considering the wide swath of time that I'm covering in this first section. But that said, we do have some of the tools referenced in these texts. So you can kind of see on the screen here, we have a large spinning wheel known as a walking wheel, which was a French-Canadian style of spinning that spread to Ontario and elsewhere. We do have a walking wheel in the collection, and it's stored with the wheel and the base separated and kept upright with a molded base and a suspension system off the ceiling of the collections room. So it can kind of stay upright in that position. We also have 2 swifts, a floor model and a tabletop umbrella model. The floor model is made of rough-hewn logs with a sturdy rectangular base, and the pegs on the ends of the wheel can rotate to apply or remove pressure on the skein. The table model is the one that all of us, if we're knitters, are more likely familiar with, as this umbrella design of the wood pieces means that it can be folded and conveniently packed away when not in use, and you can still buy yarn swifts made out of wood that operate this way today. I personally have one. They're very easy to find new and also antique. Our records tell us, this is also sort of pretty exciting because it's hard to date a lot of these items, but we have a pair of handmade knitting needles, and our records tell us that these were made in the 1850s. So at this point in time, standardized sizes and the ability to get standardized gauge didn't exist in the same way that it does today. So these needles are made out of wood, they're in very good condition, but one of the needles is missing its end cap. So it's really interesting to see sort of that early technology, the hand-carved aspect as well. We also have a set of spinning wheel blueprints, and in terms of archival material, we do have a few other items as well. So on the left side of the screen, or sorry, rather center of the screen, I should say, we have a copy of the spinning wheel patent blueprint. This one is for the Victoria spinning wheel, which was invented by a carpenter in London, Ontario in 1856. So you can kind of see, like, as this technology is being developed and patented, while the base function remains the same, we're able to track sort of these innovations when we have access to blueprints like this. On the right side of the screen, we unfortunately don't have a date for it, and we're not sure the names of the women depicted, but based on their clothing, my most educated guess would be the late 1860s or early 1870s. This is a cabinet card photograph, and the figure seated on the left in particular, if you look closely, is wearing a knitted necktie in a light white yarn with a darker color stripe. So tying back into Trail's previous observations, we know that stripes would have been a very popular way to add color and visual interest to knitting in this time period, and we can see that reflected in the photograph as well. And then on the top left of the screen, we have a photo of Isabel and Alexander Dow. And at this time, photography was still very expensive, and if you were lucky, you may have had one portrait taken of yourself in your life. Alexander is pictured here reading a newspaper, whereas Isabel is pictured with her knitting, and the ball of yarn is resting on a nearby table with the bright white thread cutting across the frame into her waiting hands. We can only wonder what Isabel's motivation was for bringing her knitting for the portrait, but we absolutely know that it must have been very important to her if she wanted to be immortalized working on her craft. The photo has no date, but based on their clothing, I would estimate the photo was taken around the 1870s, though more likely the 1880s. So overall, the period between 1827 to 1870 prioritizes serviceable knits and cold weather gear. This starts to change as we near the turn of the century, but remains a significant trend in Canadian knitting for decades. And let's face it, knitting is perfect for the kind of climate that we have here. So moving on to the next period, 1880 to 1914. General trends, knitting is still serviceable and turning towards the fashionable as well. Cities are getting bigger, rural areas are starting to get electricity, mail order magazines are increasingly becoming available and an excellent medium for showing off new trends and styles. And from photos in our collection, it's very clear that the citizens of Osgoode Township were quite fashionable and clearly keeping up with the new fashion trends emerging in this period. So one such example of these magazines is The Dillionator, which was an American publication that had a Canadian publishing branch based out of Toronto. And while the content of the magazine didn't change that much, Canadian subsidiaries had packets, which were made to include advertisements for Canadian companies instead. This example, the one that I have on the screen here, is held at the U of T Rare Books Library and is also available online. And they're very helpful to consult as they can provide more contextual information for this period, as the information is able to travel more freely in sort of these mass print culture publications. So you can kind of see I've included a image of a lace baby cap pattern. So maybe, like with the lacework stockings beside, maybe a magazine would have a lacework pattern that you liked that you could just kind of plant onto your own garment or something like that. So I mentioned the stockings, of course. We're fortunate to actually have some information about these knitted stockings. They're made of cotton and were knit in 1880 by a Mrs. Alex Meldrum. They feature vertical patterns of delicate open work, and other than the discoloration and staining, these stockings are in remarkable condition given their age. We also wanted to include a example of crochet on this blue silk wedding dress. So my assumption is that the owner already had the blue dress and dressed it up with this detachable crochet button placket and matching crochet cuffs to change the look for her wedding. So to kind of spruce up or change, make special a dress you already had would have been very common for special occasions like that, when you can't just go out to the store and buy a whole new dress.
In this period, we also see, sort of reflected in our artifacts, a rise in knitting for money advertising and technologies. We know that knitted goods for extra family income was a common practice, but with the increasing availability of knitting machines, like you see at the bottom of the screen, it seems the greatest advertising rhetoric was this is a tool to make extra income. And we're also very fortunate to have the trade literature associated with that machine, as you can see just above it. Another piece of technology we have from this time period are two models of the Stuart Clipper, patented in the US, England, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Cuba, etc. Not entirely sure what that means. These shearers represent two back-to-back models. Both are hand-cranked and were developed around 1912. The articulated arm was replaced with a fully flexible arm that made shearing much easier, and when electric models were invented, the design remained the same, just electrified. At this point in time, industrial wool mills were all across the province, and farmers in the Winchester Press newspapers were being encouraged to sell their wool to these factories to produce commercial yarns and woolen cloth. Shearers like this were just one part of that economic process. We also have some examples of children's clothing. Overall, we have a lot that fits into this category. However, most of those objects are undated. We have a lone child's mitt dated to 1904 and some child's booties which are dated to 1897. We also have a fantastic pair of knit men's socks sent to Hugh McDiarmid in 1907. They feature a variety of stripe patterns, and the socks are made using a textured stitch, ribbing, and stockinette, and they are very bright, which is really fun to see for this period. Unlike the previous era, photography is now starting to become more accessible and popular for the average person, and we have a number of photos in the collection that reflect this and also depict knitting. I thought these two were a fun example. The one on the left is a portrait of a child taken between 1907 and 1915 and shows knee-high knit stockings. And on the right is the Piper Douglas family portrait taken in winter in the early 1890s. The children are visibly wearing knit socks, and the younger is also wearing a knit sweater. So at this point, we move into our next era, 1914 to 1918, which is the period of the First World War. Many knitters in the township would have been familiar with knitting at this point, these basic and serviceable patterns. When the war broke out, these knitters mobilized within the first months of the First War to produce socks and other knitted comforts. Red Cross branches popped up across the province, including one in Metcalfe, which is about 10 minutes north of the museum. Socks were especially vital, and by the end of the war, it was estimated that 75,000 British soldiers died of complications related to trench foot. The soggy conditions of the trenches couldn't readily be fixed, but medical interventions like greasing the feet and having fresh socks to change into was meant to help the worst of these symptoms. In my research, I had a hard time finding standardized patterns for the early years of the war, but ended up studying a Red Cross booklet from 1918. In these early years, it seemed that knitters would produce any pattern for socks until governing bodies like the Red Cross started to publish standardized patterns. Some of the rules for sock knitting included no color on the socks for fear of dye leaks going into open wounds or blisters, which could, of course, lead to infection. Specific techniques for joining new yarn was another standardized element. You were to avoid knots or thicker sections of yarn as the friction could cause blisters. And the development and implementation of the Kitchener stitch to finish the toe was also created and used for this reason. And if you knit socks, you are going to be very familiar with the Kitchener stitch. It is probably to this day one of the more popular techniques for finishing off socks. They estimated that a soldier could determine if a sock would cause a blister in only 100 feet of marching. So all of these details were very important for that overall comfort for the soldier. It was not an exaggeration to say a poorly knit sock could kill a man. Attention to detail was essential, and in some cases, people were discouraged from knitting and encouraged to partake in other war work to avoid creating a sock capable of such a thing. In this area, the Red Cross had established a workroom in downtown Ottawa. It was a central location to pick up yarn, drop off finished materials, or use the knitting and sewing machines on site to do your war work. When the Red Cross eventually published their knitting patterns, they were rapidly reproduced in newspapers throughout the country, oftentimes without citation. The Red Cross also prepared completed care packages with other personal materials like paper, pencils, shaving, paraphernalia, and more. Another important wartime infrastructure related to knitting was the Comfort Fund, headed by Captain Mary Plummer of Ottawa and Captain Joan Arnoldi of Toronto. At its strength, there were 5 enlisted women who managed the fund, along with the volunteer labor of officers' wives posted in England. The Comfort Fund was raised as a militia unit, so it was only in operation during times of war. It was a central distribution point for knitwear. Parcels received would be sorted, and through the department's tracking of troop movements, could dispatch the comforts anywhere the Canadians were serving. They published a fundraising book and regular newsletters to keep the Canadian public aware of their work and to promote themselves as the most reliable way of distributing the knitted goods, rather than addressing parcels to army camps, which were frequently changing. In addition to the Canadian nursing sisters, these were the only other enlisted women during the First World War. We have a number of World War I artifacts at the museum, but few speak to knitwear specifically. In particular, we actually start to see sort of our first knitting booklets. We have 3 copies of the Every Woman's Needlecraft companion magazine, and we have two out of 3 of them are dated. So 1918 and 1919. These booklets included knitting patterns for a variety of civilian garments, soldierly wear, as well as recommended gifts to send overseas, properly entrenching them within the war years. As the patterns were transitioning out of the war years, one interesting sort of set of instructions that I found was a page of recommendations for scrap yarn to make novelties for millinery, including a crochet poppy. So already that imagery, which we're so familiar with, is starting to come up in these magazines as early as 1919. We also have a pair of colorwork mittens in blue, red, and wine made for William Porteous in 1915. Typically, colorwork styles are most associated with 1940s knitting trends due to the Make, Do, and Mend initiatives. An earlier example, such as these mittens, especially in our collection, is one of a kind and can provide us with more details about pre-1940s decorative knitting in this area. We also have a pair of diced hose which belonged to William Anderson. These stockings were part of his World War I uniform when he enlisted in the 77th Battalion of the 42nd Highland Regiment. He enlisted on December 4th, 1915. These styles of stockings were knit without feet, typically to save on bulk as well as cost for the decorative diamond design. The pattern section is visible above the boot cuff. On close inspection, there is visible mending done in black, purple, and red threads in various sections. And another piece of knitwear that you can see if you ever come visit the museum is a reproduction pair of World War I soldier socks, which we created for educational purposes for the field trip that we host, or really just for, it comes up a lot the amount of times I've shown people the socks. We don't have a pair of soldier socks, and considering how frequently they got used up and worn down, that makes a lot of sense. So there's absolutely a place for reproduction in museum education, and I'm really glad to have been able to knit those up from the Red Cross manual. So right after the First World War, there was a slight lull in knitting, and understandably so. People were pretty tired and burnt out from having, to live through that period. We can do our best to imagine what that would have been like for them. This, however, didn't stop knitting from being developed, and by the 1920s, every yarn manufacturer had realized the importance of published patterns. So from the interwar period, we start to see more pattern booklets be developed and distributed, picking up during the 1930s and gaining major popularity in the 1940s and into the Second World War and beyond. An interesting trend began to emerge when we studied the artifacts from this time period as well, that there was a demonstrable bridging of historic trends and newly emerging trends evident even in our small sample size. So on the top left of the screen, we have another knitting machine instruction book, the Auto Knitter. Much like the earlier sock knitter, this booklet from the 1920s was intended to inform users on how to operate the Auto Knitter knitting machine, but spreads from inside the book also heavily discuss monetizing the final products. At this point, considering the time period from the previous machine, this type of encouragement and rhetoric has now been a mainstream fixture for at least 30 years in the commercial space as an incentive to purchase this technology, and even longer as well as an established cottage industry, which we saw from Trail and Moody's writing. We also start to see an increase in knitted sportswear like this 1920s bathing suit. So we might scoff at a wool knitted bathing suit, but for this time period, this would have been a very liberating choice compared to the full coverage fabric bathing suits of generation earlier. This would have been a lot more form-fitting, very customizable. You can see in this one, it actually has shorts built into it. So this really would have been sort of fun, flirty, very 1920s, very form-fitting, flattering, and the wool has this wonderful benefit of still keeping you warm even when it's wet. So we have now kind of moved on from that style. I myself would love to try knitting a 1920s bathing suit and see what it's like to actually swim in it. But for our ancestors, for this time period, this would have been really quite something. We also have beside it a 1929 hockey sweater, and this is our first example of a synthetic and machine knit item in the collection. So right around keeping on trend with when we see this in other areas of the country. The sweater is red with white stripes with a contrast white neckband and cuffs. The M for Metcalf is an applique piece layered in the center of the sweater. It's unclear if the sweater was purchased commercially and customized later or if it was a custom order, but it does have an interesting general hockey connection with Monarch. So beside that, we have our Monarch knitting booklet from the interwar period. It is very well loved. I would assume it's probably 1920s, based off of hair and clothing styles. Monarch was established in 1903 in Dunnville, Ontario, and apparently formed in response to the growing popularity of sweaters. It operated a woolen mill and eventually a publishing department, and it ceased sales in the 1960s. In that time, however, it became one of the largest manufacturers for NHL hockey sweaters, in addition to their manufacturing and sales sides. They also had subsidiary offices established in Buffalo, New York as well. And across their three Canadian branches and one American branch, they frequently advertised themselves as the world's largest manufacturers of knitted goods, also hand knitting yarns. And beside that, we have a beehive knitting booklet, likely from the 1930s, given the outfit the model's wearing on the front cover. Beehive was a brand name part of the Pattons and Baldwin Yarn Company, which was a hugely popular brand from England with subsidiaries and publishing offices in Canada. This company is still producing yarn and patterns today. And above all that, a lovely photo of Jenny Dow feeding her chickens, dressed in a sweater to do the farm work. This photo was also featured in our emotional support chicken knit along, as it's one of the only photos we have in the collection showing a lady with her chickens. It's also a great depiction of the many uses of knitwear in this period, as we are now seeing it represented in the collection as being used for more active work like sports and farm labor. So, 1939, the Second World War was declared. Knitters once again mobilized quickly to prepare care packages, knitwear, plant victory gardens, and more as their patriotic duty. This mobilization happened a lot quicker in the Second World War, with knitting booklets appearing as early as 1940. So they had kind of already done this once, they knew what to expect, and that, I believe, is probably why this information started to come up much, much sooner compared to the First World War. Civilian knitting was more popular in this period compared to the First War, if we are to heed, at least in terms of, sort of newspaper public opinion pieces. There is some suggestion that civilian knitting was patriotic, as dressing well was actually a morale booster for soldiers on leave visiting home. And it was kind of patriotic. Oh, you knitted it yourself. You're participating in Make Do and Mend. You're using up yarn scraps so more can go overseas. It was sort of an attractive, patriotic, and morale boosting activity. The Make Do and Mend initiative promoted many new styles, including shorter crops for tops, colorwork patterns that use up scraps, and sewing manuals that came out on how to remake old clothes into something new. Much like items related to World War I, we have a number of World War II artifacts that aren't knitted, and actually, as you can see here, most of our knitting-related items for this period are archival in nature. On the left of the screen is our most recent acquisition, comprising of Book 1 and Book 2 of the Red Cross Knitting for War Work series. Number 2 in particular, Knitted Comforts for Women, is particularly uncommon, and there have been no digitized copies made available online that I've been able to find. The two booklets came wrapped in a homemade leather cover, as the books were used extensively during the war. Below that is an abridged copy of Volume 1 that was distributed in phone books by the Yellow Pages, which was a popular way for this type of information to be distributed to the public in these, potentially unexpected places. Beside that is a loose sheet of paper, which is actually a typewritten copy of a pattern from the Red Cross pamphlet. So again, the same information. The Red Cross for Knitting for War Work is really the be-all, end-all of official Canadian World War II knitting. And we can see we have 3 copies of more or less the same set of patterns. So very important. This is very indicative of how many people were using these patterns to produce war comforts. Above that, Monarch makes a return with more sort of civilian hand knit styles. Monarch pamphlets published during the war years would often include 1 to 2 pages of military knitting mixed in with fashionable knitting, so you're getting a bit of both. And it was certainly a subtle way, or perhaps not so subtle way, of promoting knitting for war work. So you could kind of take it as, oh, if you're knitting for yourself, spare a thought for a soldier. Or there's sort of that encouragement of you want to do war work, and as an incentive, here are some patterns that would, kind of be fun for you to knit for yourself. So there's a couple of different ways of interpreting why they may have done that, but certainly accessibility, having those popular Monarch brand yarns, Monarch brand books, now you get wartime patterns in there as well. This information is really finding many avenues to reach Canadian knitters. And I mentioned civilian knitting and sewing was also still very popular and encouraged. We have this book on crochet and knitted bedspreads with tatting and lace making and doilies. So a couple of different varieties of crafts also coming out in different types of books as well that don't really have that focus on military history. Or sorry, military knitting. And then, sort of lastly, we actually do have a knitted sweater from this period, which belonged to Waldemar Hamel, and it was his uniform sweater. And his daughter donated the sweater to the museum recently and was able to share some of his story with us. So, Waldemar Hamel was born in 1906 in St. Marylebone, England. In 1920, he was offered to be sent to Canada or Australia through the Annie Macpherson scheme, which is the British Home Children. He chose Canada because of the depictions shown in movies, and he traveled on the SS Metagama, debarked in Bellevue, and settled on the Kennedy family farm in Vernon. He then lived with the Crerar family, and with both families he worked as a farmhand, and according to his daughter, he was never adopted but treated very well. He enlisted with the Canadian Army in 1939 at 32 years old. And as I mentioned before, this sweater was sort of part of his military issue uniform. It's drab green wool with long sleeves, knit in size large with ribbing in the waistband and cuffs. So moving on to our last era for this presentation, we see a lot of change in this time period. As the war is over, we're kind of going into the baby boom period, an era of peace and relative peace and stability. The immediate post-war era really saw this boom in knitting for babies, toddlers, and children, and it became extremely popular to have these types of projects to work on while staying home, and as a way to clothe a growing family, on a budget. The 1960s were also an important decade for Canadian ideas of heritage and living history, and museums like Upper Canada Village and Black Creek Pioneer Village were established to celebrate the 1967 centenary. Knitting continued to remain passively popular, but another great knitting boom wouldn't happen more recently until the sort of 2020 lockdowns. Overall, knitting has always been an active job and hobby and, very much enjoyed in Canada, whether it be for leisure or for pay. But certain periods like the First World War, the Second World War, the baby boom, and the start of the pandemic represent these major spikes in popularity. With regards to artifacts, we have yet another knitting booklet, this one belonging to Lux. It features a series of knitting patterns for the whole family, which is sort of a new genre that's starting in this period. This one is a little interesting for the broader publication history, as it would have been among the first in the post-war publication cycle after the paper shortages had ended. So it was marketed as having these family patterns. We see that as sort of this decade is bringing that change. You can knit matching mom and daughter sweaters, something for the husband, something for your son, all in this one book. So Lux originally started as a soap company, and much of the messaging in their knitting booklets talk about using the right soap for your skin as well as your knitwear. You've spent so many hours knitting this beautiful piece, you don't want to ruin it with the wrong soap. So buy Lux and also, buy our knitting booklet for 50 cents. The company originally started in England, but had publishing departments in many locations. And my coworker has an edition of Lux from 1951, which was the year they started publishing again. And the inside of the front cover has some interesting information. What I found in particular the most interesting was this intro is almost identical to the Australian edition of the same magazine, with necessary geographical information changed. So I'll give this one a read. Here at last, the new 1951 Lux knitting booklet you've been waiting for, bigger and better than ever. It's designed by Canadians for Canadian knitters from Newfoundland to Vancouver Island, and filled with garments that suit our tastes, our climate, and our way of life. More than 7 years have elapsed since the last Lux knitting book came off the presses. That entire edition was sold out in the first few weeks, and due to wartime paper shortages, we could not print another. But scarcely a week has gone by in all those 7 years when we have not received requests for copies. That we think is a clear indication of the popularity of Lux knitting books. A popularity that started with the very first Lux knitting book back in 1938. So there you have it, some sort of interesting introduction there from Newfoundland to Vancouver Island, and then the Australian version, of course, just changed those cities. But in any case, kind of an interesting, welcome back. The war is done. Here, enjoy some more patterns. So, kind of into the rest of that era, our museum was founded in 1973. Prior to being the Osgoode Township Museum, the first version of the group was actually known as the New Horizons Historical Group. And this photo that you see of the three women spinning, we believe, is from either a quilt show that we hosted in the 70s or our former Pioneer Days event. And this photo was taken in 1976. So, like I mentioned before, to tie in with the growing popularity of heritage demonstrations in the 60s and 70s, for that, this is our heritage kind of celebration, that period was so sort of soaked in. These, are obviously still very important things, demonstrations and education that museums do to this day. So we can really not only track that trend throughout museology, but in our own understanding of heritage, textile and fiber work has very much been there since day one. And I couldn't help but include this school photo with a little colorwork sweater. We do know it was of Randy Irwin, and it's great to see the change in colorwork styles between this one and the 1915 mitt. Stylistically, very different, as well as the use and application of color. On the bottom right is an adult night school class, and it shows many of the students wearing knit cardigans. The class was taught by Mrs. Dow, and the image was taken by Joe Rowan. Above that, Four Generations at Christmas, featuring a knit cardigan as well. This photo was featured in our holiday exhibit last year, so we've kind of had that one circulating around the museum recently. And lastly, this garment is on display in our permanent gallery, an example of a machine knit hockey sweater, probably one of Canada's most enduring knits, so much so that there is a children's book that has been written about it. This sweater in particular belongs to Larry Robinson, one of our local legends and professional hockey player, and this sweater is from 1976 from his time playing with the Montreal Canadiens. So, in terms of these kinds of trends, 1967 was a big year for museums and heritage as it was celebrating the Canadian centennial, and we can kind of see how fiberwork falls into this sort of future facing as well as retrospective understanding of our history. And lastly, I just wanted to show you a couple of our undated artifacts. Many of these items are hard to estimate, but putting them all together, regardless of the known date, it does reveal some interesting information to us. The serviceable knitting that is almost a mainstay in Canadian knitting culture is prevalent in this category, which is mostly comprised of children's mitts, socks, and booties. There are also a few lone mitts, a blanket, spools, needle cases, a scarf, and clothes for a teddy. The most prominent colors are white, beige, green, black, and red, with two standout colorful stockings in a peach tone blend and a teal, green, and pink combo. Stitch types represented include garter stitch, stockinette stitch, shepherd stitch, crochet, lacework ribbing, and some machine knitting. Overall, with the artifacts represented in the collection, we get a better understanding of the role that knitting played in the former Osgoode Township and how this rural community was participating actively in this skilled work in a variety of forms. Era for era, the knitters of Osgoode were keeping up with the trends. What I love most across the collection is how so many of the pieces show wear and visible mending. When the museum was founded, it was the families in the area, many of whom had lived here for decades, who made up the bulk of those donations. So what we really see, this collection of well-loved, well-used, well-repaired items, which we now have the chance to show others just how special knitting is and was in the township. So thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. And if you have any questions, we'll move into the Q&A.